1. I was watching a movie in my old apartment building when I heard a thundering crash. This was a bit jarring since I had headphones on and was watching on a laptop unnecessarily since my roommate was out of town, but it was a habit. I quickly got up and left my room, and that's when I felt the cold draft. I looked to my right where the bathroom door stood ajar, to the open window. I knew for a fact that the window hadn't been open earlier, and that window was attached to the fire escape, and my immediate thought was, someone is in my apartment. I quickly turned on all the lights in every room and checked every closet, phone in hand, ready to call the police. But there was no one. Small city apartment, takes 30 seconds to check it all. I went back to the bathroom and looked more closely. Everything from the vanity had been thrown into the toilet, a whole 2 feet away. But where had the crash come from? It had been a thundering crash after all. I'd felt the vibrations in my bones. I still didn't feel safe, so I leave my apartment and go into the hall. Then I notice a common hall window, which also leads to the fire escape, is also open. That window is never open. I call the police. When they arrive, they search my apartment, then ask me if it was possible that the bathroom vanity stuff had blown into the toilet, a whole 2 feet away. I tell them no, because I never left the window open, and there was still a crash that nobody can account for. The police go up the fire escape and discover another open window 3 floors up. They enter the apartment because they believe the intruder may still be in there. I watch from the door and see that the apartment has been ransacked, everything on the floor a massive mess. Why didn't that happen to my apartment? Why was only my vanity stuff thrown in the sink? The police get my statement and leave. I lock everything up tight and sleep relatively well considering the night's events. I even feel bad for the people upstairs whose apartment was trashed. But that still doesn't explain the thundering boom I heard. The next day, the building manager calls and asks me to come to his office. He shows me a video of a hooded man entering the front of the building and asks if I know him. I told him I did not. The manager then informs me that the hooded man is the one who had broken into my apartment and the apartment 3 floors above mine the night before. I asked how he knew this. I wish I hadn't asked. Unknown to me, the back alley with the fire escape has a camera on it. We know that the hooded man had entered the building from the front, and it was guessed that he went up a few floors somewhere and exited from a common hallway onto the fire escape. But then I had to watch as this hooded man in the darkness of a Friday night slinks down the fire escape and crawls into my bathroom window, knowing full well that the occupant inside the apartment was me, completely defenseless. Then it all clicks into place. I knew why my apartment was left untouched. As I said, I was watching a movie at that time with headphones on. My desk faces away from my door, and I am the first door you reach from the bathroom. This apartment was very old, 100 plus years actually, and there were no locks on the inner apartment doors. The hooded man had possibly opened my door, seen me inside, and decided not to attack me, even though my guard was completely down. My back was to him, and my headphones meant I couldn't hear footsteps. It also meant that he saw the light from under my door and decided to leave before making any more noise. Which brings us to near the end, because the video feed I was being shown wasn't over. I had to watch as the hooded man crawled back out of my apartment after he decided not to ransack my place too. Then he jumped onto the fire escape, which came down with a thundering crash. We never did find out who it was. We do know that it was either someone who lived in the building, or they knew someone in the building well enough to be given the front door code. Never in my life did I think that I'd watch a video feed of someone crawling into my home knowing that I'm inside, and remains one of my creepiest encounters in my life. Stay safe out there, folks. 2. I just turned 21 and frequented the bars regularly. In hindsight, I probably spent too much time drinking with my friends. I didn't have a car or a cell phone, and I lived on the outskirts of town. It was a 45-minute walk downtown. The town I live in is generally a very safe place. It is a wealthy, well-to-do, white-bread community, so walking home alone at night after drinking was nothing that bothered me other than the actual walking. It was a Tuesday night, and that means pints are cheap. So I wouldn't say I was completely wasted, but I certainly was more than tipsy. Instead of walking along the sidewalk, where I feared I'd be picked up by the police for being drunk in public, I decided to take the bike path that ran along the train tracks. This meant the walk would take longer but much safer and less likely I'd run into any sort of trouble. Or so I thought. The bike path was not very well lit, and knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more nervous about walking alone in the complete darkness at 2 in the morning. Like I said, I had just turned 21 and was certainly an arrogant young male who was thinking about women and not minding my surroundings. I had taken this path many nights, and coming across anybody else was rare. If I did perchance come across somebody this late at night, most of the time it was just another drunk college student who had the same thoughts as me. Either that or they were homeless, but if so, I'd say they were all harmless. So this night as I'm walking, I noticed further down the path was somebody walking towards me. He wore a large hiking backpack and had his hoodie pulled over his head. It was so dark I couldn't see their face. I could really only just barely make out their outline. This person's gait unquestionably revealed him to be a male who I figured was probably just a transient. It was odd to see somebody walking towards downtown at 2 in the morning. When I got really close to him and we were about to cross paths, this person just stopped dead in his tracks, and I could tell he was staring at me because his head just followed me as I walked away. It creeped me out a bit, and I certainly felt like that was a bit odd. As I continued to walk, shrugging at the situation, I just didn't feel right. Something in my gut made me feel wrong. I stopped and turned around to see this person still staring at me. "What?" I asked him, as I stopped walking and remained to stare back at him. That's when he hissed at me, like a snake. A long, vicious-sounding hiss that made the hair in the back of my neck stand up. I had hoped it was just being weird, or perhaps was on meth or something. I nervously laughed a bit and said, "Okay," and continued to walk on. I made it a few more steps and turned to look back. He somehow managed to get closer to me without making a sound. He stood completely still. I figured perhaps I was just drunk or imagining things. I turned back around and walked, taking a few more steps. I turned around once more. Now I knew he was closer. I couldn't believe I couldn't hear him approaching behind me. What unsettled me even more was how every time I turned around he'd managed to stop and stand completely still. You following me, buddy?" Once again he let out this creepy hiss, just staring at me. Now I was freaked out and had this strange sensation that I was some sort of prey. "Hey, fuck you, man," I now yelled. In hindsight, that was a bad idea, but because I already felt like I was some sort of target, and the last thing I should have been wanting to do is provoke this sick, twisted bastard. I started backing away at this point, not taking my eyes off him. He just stood there hissing. The hisses were getting longer, louder, and more malice was apparent in him. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first they were basic steps, but the further I backed away, the more he sped up, taking bigger steps towards me. I said, "Forget this," to myself. "I'm getting out of here." I noped it out of there and began into a full-fledged run. He started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots gaining on me, hissing like a cat, growling like a dog. I feel his spit hitting me in the back of the neck. "Get away from me," I yelled. I might have peed myself, I was so scared. All I could think to do was run as fast as I could and to get inside of my house quickly as possible. I've always been a very fast runner, but this guy was much taller than me and his legs were really long. Though he was really cutting down the distance between him and me. I managed to keep a good 5 between us, though, checking back behind me as I saw his arms reaching out in an attempt to grab me. I finally made it out of the bike path and onto the crossing sidewalk of the street that was lit up by lamps and a few passing cars. I was so relieved to finally make it back to civilization. There was a gas station over by my house, and I thought I'd run to the safety of its inside, only to see that the lights had been shut off and its doors were closed. It was closed. I had to make it to my house. As I got closer to my house, I could see my roommate's lights were on through the window. "Chris," I shouted. "Chris, open the door! Open the door!" I'm impressed I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me. I saw the front door of my house open up and my roommate standing at the doorway looking confused. I ran up the steps and almost jumped inside my house, slamming the door shut behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" he asked. You didn't see the guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and looked outside. He was gone. I have no idea what really happened to him, but I'm sure that it really happened. Whoever that guy who hissed at me was really shook me up, and I never walked down that bike path after dark anymore. 3. I, 24 female, used to go to the smaller university in my city, where I worked as a bartender at the university bar. I also lived about 5 minutes away from campus, which was really convenient most of the time for naps between classes, but it lost its touch after this encounter. I usually worked day shifts on Sundays. I didn't have any classes, and my best friend, Dan, 23 male, also worked with me there. We were really close, so he would hang out during my shift before relieving me most nights. I've known Dan for years, and although a sweetheart, he is often quite oblivious. One day, while Dan was sitting at the bar entertaining me during my shift, a guy sat next to him. The guy seemed normal, around my age, and wasn't bad-looking either. He had blonde, disheveled hair and pretty sculpted muscles. He had also clearly come from a construction site because he had work boots and a hard helmet hanging from his belt. This wasn't unusual, because we did have a lot of construction eras, and most construction workers in the area were also students at the university. I struck up a conversation with him, going through all the customer service chit-chat that I was used to saying. When I was busy with another customer, he turned to Dan and started chatting with him, and they seemed to get on quite well. However, I could tell every now and again that the guy kept on sneaking glances at me, which was flattering the first couple of times, and not uncommon as a female bartender. But the longer he did it, I realized there was something that was off with him when he looked at me. Rather than flirtatious, it was like he was watching me, watching exactly what I was doing, where I was going, how I walked, how I greeted people. It was like he was surveilling me, sizing me up even. This really set me off for obvious reasons, but also because I've dated a couple of abusive, controlling guys in the past, and the behavior seemed all too familiar. This was when he started to loop me in on him and Dan's conversation. He asked if we knew each other. Obvious answer, yes. We'd been joking with each other when he arrived. He then asked me how we met and kept asking personal questions about the two of us. I already saw his ramp-up coming a mile away before he asked if we were dating. Dan laughed because we get that all the time. We're really close, and very comfortable with each other platonically. Dan, being his oblivious self, said no, and that he was dating his girlfriend, whom I adore, but that I was single. I immediately saw a shift in demeanor from the guy, who then turned to me to smile. Although a pretty ordinary response, it sent chills down my spine. Many people would just think he was happy to be able to flirt with me freely, but the look in his eyes was telling. He was pleased because he wanted me to himself. Now, to take a step back, I know that seems like a slight overreaction, but trust me, I know that type of look, and it was frightening as all hell. After that, he started asking me personal questions specifically. I tried to go to other customers and act busy to avoid them. Sometimes Dan would answer for me, and I swear that dumb kid thought he was wingmanning me, but God, he was so wrong. The guy asked me how old I was, what I was studying at school, where I was from, and all other kinds of normal but slightly invading questions as a stranger. Finally, Dan got up to get on shift, which meant that mine was almost over. Because the guy didn't really do anything out of the norm, I didn't pull Dan aside, but just patiently waited until I could just go and have a beer far away from this guy. As Dan went into the back, the guy turned his sole attention to me. He asked me what kind of shows I'd like to watch, and I answered half-heartedly as I cleaned behind the bar near him. Then suddenly I looked up, and I saw that his face was inches from mine. He had leaned up onto the bar, and I could literally smell him. That's how close he was. He then asked me if I lived alone. I did, at that time, but there was no way in hell I was telling this creep that. So I gulped, shook my head, and said I lived with 2 roommates. I thought adding 2 bodies would deter him. He leaned back down onto his seat and hummed. I saw a gleam in his eye that left me convinced he knew I was lying. At this point I was shaking, which is really frustrating and unusual for me, because I often keep up a rather stoic appearance when it comes to creeps. He seemed to notice and smiled. Then, with a nod, he got up, put on his jacket. "See you later, Gemma." Then he left. just in time for Dan to come out from the back, the bastard. Dan saw immediately how shaken I was and asked what was wrong. I could barely respond because the thing was I'd never introduced myself to the guy. I'd forgotten to. And no one around had said my name, I know, because I asked Dan if anyone had, but the guy knew my name. Unfortunately, that's not the end of this story. After that encounter, I was on high alert for about 4 days. Then I got busy with studying and life stuff, and it went to the back of my mind, but not for long. Suddenly, I started seeing the guy everywhere, in the hallways, near my classes, and at the bar. Coincidence turned into obvious intent, and I was freaked out. My university was small, and there was very little for me to do to avoid him. My biggest worry was that he'd seen the way I walked home, so I started to ask people to drive me, even though I lived 5 minutes away. None of my friends minded because they're very solid, which I'm very thankful for. After about 3 weeks of this, I started to tell my friends, who then started to sort of barrier around me. I was never alone outside of class, and I was always taken home by someone. I started to feel safer, and I had some other shit to deal with, so the guy sort of left my mind for a bit again. During that time, I bought a pair of old-school yellow Vans because I'm a huge fan of retail therapy when I'm depressed and or anxious. About 4 days later, I got the notice saying that they were out for delivery, and I was pretty excited. I don't usually buzz delivery guys into my building and often just let them leave a notice so I can pick the package up. But I decided to buzz this guy in one time. Immediate gratification or whatever. Anyway, I had to work late and was dropped off home by a friend around 10 p.m. I was exhausted but still stoked to get my Vans and have a small positive in my life. But when I rounded the corner to my door, my package wasn't waiting for me. This was weird because they always bring your box to your door when it's a private courier, if they're buzzed into the building. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the delivery guy hadn't found my door number, or maybe delivered it to the wrong apartment. I unlocked my door, which seemed to stick a little, which was also weird, but I shrugged that off too. But when I opened my door, something immediately felt off. Nothing was out of place, but it felt like it. I cautiously stepped into my apartment, gripping my keys between my fingers. My other hand was holding my phone tight, just on the verge of pressing down my emergency call button. That's when I turned to the one thing that wasn't there when I left that morning. My package. It was sitting on my kitchen counter with a note next to it. I started to panic and raced through my apartment, wielding my keys like a pair of claws. My apartment was small, so it was rather easy to sweep it. No one was there. Just me, my Vans, and the note. Going into survivor mode, I slammed my door, locked and bolted it, and stuck a chair underneath the handle for good measure. I checked every window to make sure they were locked, and that my patio door was as well, which was a sliding glass door. That's when I found the second thing out of place. The security bar I stick behind my patio door was underneath my couch, where you would have to have been crawling to find it. It was most definitely stuck behind my patio door when I left that morning. As you can imagine, this freaked me out even more, but I was just glad the bar wasn't broken. I placed it back as tight as possible, and then went straight towards my kitchen counter where the bastard had left me my present. My package was opened, and my first thought was, hey, that's illegal, before I reminded myself that the guy had literally just broken into my home. My shoes were intact, basically untouched. Next to the box was a handwritten note on one of those sticky pads from my desk in the other room. It read, "Small apartment for 3 people. Enjoy your Vans." Now, I'd like to tell you that I called the police and that I got everything sorted out, but that's not how this story ends. In fact, all I did was cry the whole night and have around 5 panic attacks. The police can't really do much when the guy hasn't done anything malicious, and there's no way for me to trace all of this back to one guy I didn't even know and haven't seen since. However, the school term ended right after this, and I didn't have to go to campus until September. I also immediately moved in with my 2 sisters and brother-in-law, so he had very little ways to bother me after that. But for the love of God, creepy stalker guy, let's never meet again. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories. episode 504. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. And I think we've now reached the point in the Hellfreezer tries to take a week off, where I start losing my mind because I'm a little bit behind and scrambling to catch up. So it's essentially record, snack, sleep, kinda, and record. Okay, and with that in mind, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.